This one's I thought this was a fun topic when initially when I was talking about this year, doing going over the topics with Kaylin and Kate, just about things that we talked about. And this one came up kind of from the get-go, just talking about reframing perspective, and kind of how we challenge the way we think about things, and where do our perspectives, our views, how do they shape our perceptions of things, and how can we challenge those to grow as individuals. I think this presentation is a little bit more about just internal growth and challenge than it is about maybe things that we apply towards, just day-to-day practice. Although at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about how we can change perspectives about, patients or colleagues or even the healthcare system that we're working in. But I think the first and foremost, I think the first thing to talk about is just kind of what is perspective and how does that differentiate from perception? So that's what this first little slide is about. It's just kind of differentiating those two. Make sure the slides will change. They're not sliding right now, so I'm going to work on that real quick. Of course, right when I want to get this going, there we go. Hopefully this will make it going. All right. So, the main thing is that a perspective is a point of view, and I think like an easy example of this is just like point of view, say of politics. Like if you have a conservative view or something, or a liberal view of things, it's your point of view of how you see things as it relates to some sort of topic. Like what is your perspective in it? How do you see this? Where perception is more of an interpretation of things, and it's more collective. In fact, and it's the next slide we'll kind of talk about. Perspective is more about the accumulation of maybe perspectives and what we've seen and our points of view and how they shape how we kind of interact with the world as a whole. So that's kind of really where we're kind of coming from. A perception doesn't embrace just like a single perspective. It is more of this kind of coalition of ideas and values and attitudes, experience that give us insight, as for perspective is more of that direct point of view of something. So I think it's important when we're going to do this presentation is to take a few minutes and just talk about perception, because perception is this accumulation of perspective. And kind of where does this come from? Where do we get our perceptions? How do they affect how we act and behave, and how can they sometimes stunt us in growing forward or moving forward. So the first thing is just kind of looking at how do we how we view our life as our perceptions. What's the meaning that we put behind our views, and those come from a variety of different sources. Mainly our life experiences. Our life experiences are big dictators of like our perceptions of the world. If we grew up in a positive environment with positive messages, and we had opportunities to do a lot of different things, our perception of the world is much different than somebody that may have had limitations to some of those opportunities. And it's also about the environments we grow up in, like what does the environment around us say, or what is some of the obstacles that we had in our environments and how they form our perceptions. And then the last one is our belief systems. I think our belief systems kind of fall into more of that perspective view, like what do we believe, and then why do we believe that? And I think our belief systems, and coupled with our environments and our experiences, kind of create our worldview perceptions. And so then we kind of run into how do perceptions shape our actions, and I think that's really kind of where we talk about there can be some obstacles. Because if we get these perceptions and we get these kind of big worldviews, this accumulation of ideas, and they can either sit there and help us motivate towards a direction that we want to go because of, whatever our perception is and these experiences we have, and it can be a real, helpful tool in like pushing us and driving us towards directions. Now, sometimes the way it motivates us is in a positive direction. Sometimes it motivates us in sometimes not so positive directions. But it also can protect us, because of what we've seen. We can sometimes use those experiences and these perceptions to keep us out of danger. And the other thing that it really does is also allows us to make judgments about things. And I think this is where we talk about, when we're going to talk about changing perspectives. This is, I think, the piece that's, going to be a real challenge, because I think we make judgments all the time. I mean, it's just part of being a human. We have to make judgments about situations, environments we're in, the people we're around, but sometimes our perceptions and our perspectives can really influence some judgments that may not always be accurate. It may be based more on a feeling than a reality, through the things we've experienced. And I think that's where we're going to talk about as far as changing perspectives is, what do we know? What do our judgments tell us? Sometimes they're founded in reality, and there's accurate information to have that we're making, an appropriate choice or judging a situation fairly. And then there's times when we are making judgments based off a feeling through experience, or feeling through our belief system, or feeling through some sort of situation or environment that we're in, that can sometimes, be a little distorted, or maybe not have the full picture, that we've only allowed one perspective to come into that, and we've distorted it and kind of put a slant on how we view the situation, and don't know where the other side of the coin is coming from. And that's really kind of what we're going to talk about kind of moving forward with this in perspectives, is how do we get ourselves to challenge, what we believe, what our perspectives are, our point of views, and allow ourselves to open the doors for things that aren't necessarily in line with what our points of view and our perspective. And that can be really challenging, because we have these for a variety of different reasons why we have perspectives, and some of them are really founded and grounded. But one of the challenges we have sometimes is if we get stuck and don't allow ourselves to at least explore or understand or empathize other points of view and other perspectives, we can then become like railroaded into not being able to move any further, or always have it can affect our attitude towards working with certain people or being in certain environments, that can then it has a negative impact on us. And if I carry a perspective that's going to have it's only one side and don't understand where the other side's going, I might go into environments where all the time I'm kind of beating my head against the wall. It's like they understand, and then I find out myself that I'm the one that's kind of losing sleep, or I'm the one that's getting stressed out, that it isn't, I can't expect everybody, they're not going to change necessarily their perspective unless I'm willing to kind of understand where they're coming from. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of the next slides kind of talk about how do we change our perspectives. And the first one we talk about, how we change perspectives is to first, evaluate them. First and foremost, how do your perspectives shape you? What is the strengths that come from the perspectives that we carry, the point of views we have, and what are some of the limitations that come from that? And to really be honest with ourselves about that. That's a challenge, because a lot of times when we have something that we feel strongly about and have a perspective that's pretty ingrained, it's hard to sometimes be able to sit there and say, okay, I'm going to let that go and see how, what it might be on the other side, because we think that it's this, and it shapes us. It puts us down certain paths and directions, and sometimes doesn't allow us to see other avenues. And so, in doing that, we kind of first ask ourselves, how do they shape us? Be honest. Sometimes they may not shape us always in the best way. Then ask ourselves, where do they come from? Where are these founded in? And and a lot of times they're from the things we talked about, from religious experience, life experiences, illnesses, environments we come in. It could be a variety of different things that these can come from, and being willing to kind of look what shaped these perspectives. And then how would your life look if you challenged or changed those perspectives? I think this is a really difficult one too, because one of the examples in some of the research I was doing, just kind of talking about getting a little bit more concrete ideas how you change perspectives, and trying to get a little bit of a little bit more of a guideline or how-to on this. One of the things they use as an example is if you thought that the example they used was that you didn't think that a female could be the head of a major CEO, what would that, what shaped that opinion, and then what would it look like if you let go of that viewpoint and you change that viewpoint? And one of the things it's saying is that, just that example, and it's a pretty extreme example, is the idea that it would maybe make your work environment better if you didn't hold on to things where you kind of disqualified certain people or genders or whatever just based on a perspective you had because of maybe some experiences through life, or kind of maybe even uh, information that you had that may not have been always accurate to what the reality was, or feelings that you had. And so that's kind of one of the things that we talk about is like, what would it look like if you were willing to change that perspective and really put yourself in shoes that might be a little bit more uncomfortable, because it would go against the grain of what you believe. And then, of course, what's really important too is not only about understanding your own perspectives, but then starting to consider what other people's perspectives are, which, is one of the, can be difficult, because sometimes we're so ingrained in perspectives that when somebody has something else, believes something different than we do, we almost tend to sometimes dismiss or think that they may not be, what they're going to share, their perspective isn't as valuable, and that can be a roadblock. So the first thing to do is recognize, acknowledge that everybody's got the different perspectives. Now, sometimes we find people that align more with what we believe and what our point of view is, but everybody's got them, and everybody has the right and entitled to have their point of view and perspectives about things. Acknowledge that they're there, and to not just dismiss, and then, be willing to ask the question, what informs them? I think that's one of the things that I think as personal growth, and especially as a counselor trying to work on this, is I work with sometimes with people that have different perspectives, different point of views than what I'd have. Sometimes, they can be challenging for me from my own personal experiences. And then I have to ask myself, well, where did they get theirs from? And be empathetic to the reality is that they had different experiences, and they had different things that informed them, and their belief systems brought there, and what they think is equally as concrete or, strong to them as what my beliefs might be, or my point of views, my perspectives might be, and be able to say, okay, what brought that? What informed you? What were that bringing to? What were the benefits of that? What were some of the limitations? And being able to kind of understand where do people kind of get different points of view from. And then, and being willing to be respectful and not debate somebody. Like, one of the things that obviously we probably experience a lot just in kind of our society as a whole right now is a lot of debate and not being necessarily respectful from different points of view, and trying to, instead of trying to argue and create friction and distance, kind of listen and respect somebody for their shared experience. And that doesn't mean that we have to say that, in our own internal world, to say that's right, or that I have to then abide by what they believe or their perspective. It just means that I'm going to be respectful and hear where that came from, what was their experience, and not try to put judgment on it, instead just kind of hear what it is, which is difficult. I think that's one of my, it's a hard experience for me, and I work with people all the time, is not to put a personal judgment on something I hear. And that's one of the qualifications, or one of the core values of being a counselor, is to be non-judgmental. And it's hard not to have life influence sometimes things that we hear, especially if it's totally different or it seems out of place from what your belief system is. And then finally, when we're trying to change perspectives, is, after you've looked at yourself, explored others, then try to reformulate your perspectives. And not necessarily that you're going to totally go a different path, but to be able to bring more information into your perspective and be more well-rounded in the perspective you have. And also understand there's some points of view from another side that do make sense or have some validity to our perspective, or at least can sit there and say, even though I have this, I understand why this might be part of the reason why somebody might hold on to this belief or this perspective or this point of view. So it's to reformulate, so acknowledge that we choose our perspectives. It's not something, we are born with things, and we're given things through DNA and biology and stuff like that, but ultimately our life helps shape our perspectives, and we are influenced obviously by a multitude of things, but we get to choose them in the end. That is ours. And I think that's powerful, because I know for me, I think of my dad, and I know my dad and I have different views and different perspectives on things. Yeah, we can still get along and not have to get in disagreements or fights about anything, but we can have, I know that things I experienced were different from what he experienced, and we have different perspectives on stuff. And then be willing to educate yourself through things like, if it's taking classes or reading a variety of different things. I think that's always interesting. I've challenged myself to kind of maybe sometimes listen to like podcasts or something like that from points of views that aren't necessarily what I, ingrained in right now, just to kind of hear where the other side's coming from. So being willing to either read or listen to things that allow, the other side to share their story. Things like traveling or engaging in politics, and not engaging in politics in a combative way, but like understanding why people believe one thing and the other thing, or how can they work together. And I think the biggest one on that kind of list of things, how do you formulate or reformulating perspectives, is is volunteering. Getting out of my own shoes and getting into somebody else's shoes and seeing what it's like. It really will challenge, some of the ways I see things when I'm willing to go volunteer and see situations, environments that aren't my world. And that allows me to be much more empathetic and understanding, and not as judgmental or as blocked by some perspectives that can maybe be, rigid. And then, of course, right, the last thing would be is to incorporate that new information that you get from, learning about others and some new education and things that you bring into yourself, is, incorporate that new information and act on it. To me, one of the things is learning how to say when I'm, in a thing, is not to hold on to what I don't think is important to me, but also to say, I understand other things are important to others. Sometimes I will learn something that actually strengthens my perspective, or also learn something that will challenge it, and I can modify my perspective and then act onto those new things and give it my perspective a full flavor, a full tint to what we're trying to get to, instead of just one direction. Like I get it, it's a little bit more broader, a little bit more well-rounded. So that's just kind of like this idea of it's a quick little cheat sheet of like how can you change perspectives. And then, that's part of this exercise, this presentation is, right, just understanding what is perspective, what is perception, and how can we modify it. And then the next part about it is, we talk about some of the areas that physicians will get challenged in perspectives, and those kind of, and I labeled it, and I'll get to the slide, 3 things of, patients, colleagues, or even the healthcare systems that they're in, which I think I addressed earlier on. But just to kind of keep in this motivation of challenging, changing perspective, like a little light video, less than a couple minutes, just talking about, challenging and changing perspectives. We can watch and then kind of change the tone into kind of the physician world and challenging and changing perspectives.
There are a lot of things we miss, that we walk right by, that if we could just make a point to see them, would add tremendous value to our lives.
Oops. All right.
There's a saying that your problem is your gift. The situations that knock us down or push us back are the same situations that had the potential to move us forward, had we only looked at them a little differently. Sure, no one's positive all the time, but it's not impossible to see the value in every situation, to take what the world throws at you and turn it into your advantage, into positive energy. Life will always be what you make it, and what you make it is entirely up to you. Life's greatest accomplishments weren't always on some pedestal, always admired. They were built on the back of hardship and difficulty. They were carved out of doubt and transformed from negativity. They were turned from a loss to a gain, from the unexpected into an asset. Look, the right perspective has the ability to transform all things. When you are the one who defines your own reality, can you really afford to live your life with your eyes closed?
So it's just a little bit of a kind of a motivational video and talking about and challenging perspectives. I mean, I think one of the things it talks about why it's not specifically maybe necessarily to some of the things we talk about, I think it is talking about just in that big grand sense of perspective of like thinking positively and thinking negatively, which is part of the stuff that we've talked about throughout these couple of years of doing presentations. It's just points of view and how we come across, how we come at it. If we're coming at it in a negative place, we're going to tend to see more roadblocks, more obstacles. If we're coming at a positive place, we're going to tend to see more opportunity in areas of growth. And that's where perspectives can get us stuck. If our perspectives get us this point of view where we think this and we have a negative view about this and this and this, we're going to carry that negativity into interactions with other people. And how do we find our ways to allow ourselves to challenge perspectives so we let go of some of that? And when we're in a more positive place, we're going to be more open and willing to hear other people and be able to find more maybe avenues to being able to help other people. And so that's just kind of a little bit about that idea of this video is just kind of that motivation of like, you know, we get stuck sometimes in our point of view and our perceptions in negative places, and they can really stun us, and they can bring stress and bring, you know, unwanted hardship on ourselves. And how can we challenge that? So this next, you know, part of this presentation, just in the next, you know, 10, 15 minutes, about just going to talk about, you know, physicians and some of the obstacles that, you know, you guys face in challenging and changing perspectives, particularly with things like patients, with colleagues, and just like healthcare systems in general, which, you know, there's always when I just did a presentation yesterday and up in the Bowling Green area about, you know, medical records and this and that, nothing helps us, and you know, some of those things that we bring in that kind of keep us kind of stuck on things. So let's, you know, start with the first one, just kind of talk a little briefly about the patients and some of the things. And I looked at some articles and research, and they'll be linked to the end of this presentation, as well as I'm sure I'll give them to Caitlin to be part of the link. Just talking about the challenges sometimes with patients. You know, one of the things in quotes is the needy patient, right? The patient always has a lot of high demand and all this kind of stuff, and getting frustrated and thinking negatively, and having a person that, you know, just a lot of demand and don't think that they, you know, they may not need as much attention as they're asking for, can really kind of tint how we interact with them, you know, and being able to kind of challenge that, you know, when we think about somebody that, you know, quotes as a needy patient, like, again, we go to those change cycles that we talked about, like what's happening, what's going on with them, what's their life experience, share with them. You know, a lot of times it isn't, you know, they're not out to cause distress towards the physician by having all these demands. A lot of times it's a lot of vulnerability, a lot of insecurity, a lot of fear, you know, all these things that they came from probably their own life experiences and their own things that you know, that they've gone through and their perspectives on things. You know, and how do we challenge ourselves? Because when we get something that feels like, ugh, you know, we tend to maybe not always put the effort that we want into it. You know, and then here's another saying that was in some of the research I did, is like, it's a hospital, not a hotel. Right? I thought that was funny, right? Where we get, you know, people that are demanding a lot when they're in a hospital setting, and you know, as far as the accommodations, how they're feeling, the bed, the food, the this and that, and it's a really challenging perspective, because you're right, it's a hospital, not a hotel. But part of that is that statement is, if it's not, it's a hospital, it means that person's in a place where they're scared and they're vulnerable and something's wrong. Excuse me. And they're just looking for something that makes them feel better in a very difficult situation. You know, they're looking for some sort of security when they might be having an issue that they feel really, you know, at a loss for. And that's important to remember when we're dealing with people. It's like it is, and there's, you know, there's not the pool and maybe not the exercise room, things like that, but they're in a place where they are very, you know, frightened and vulnerable, and they're just looking for comfort to be able to feel like there's something that they can put their feet on the ground for. And on the challenge, on the vice versa, is this last one, you choose to be here, which sometimes maybe patients may throw at physicians, like this idea of, well, you chose this profession, so this is what you get. This is it. And it's like the challenge of like, well, yes, we do, you know, choose to be helpers, but you know, there's a lot to that, and there's a lot to my own personal story, a lot to your own personal stories of why we came here, and this idea that just because we're here, we should have to do this and that. You know, it's not necessarily just the end all be all to that story. That there's a lot of reasons that go behind somebody being where they're at, and why you got into the field of helping people, and that you have your own personal world and stuff like that. But there are things to be okay to say, there are boundaries around that. You need to be able to take care of yourself, even though, yes, I did sign up to be a helper to help people, and to do what I can do to kind of help heal. But if I'm not doing well or healing my own self, then I can put myself in a lot of risk and vulnerability. When it comes to colleagues and, in the challenges interacting with them, part of it is just, I had 3 topics, but even Caitlin and I were talking about one earlier, just the idea of like understanding that, she was sharing a story about like, the physician was gone and for a couple of days because they were off, and another doc worked with this patient that they were working with this previous doctor for the last 3 or 4 days, and the doc that stepped in did something that they don't understand. Why did you run this test or didn't that? And then being able to understand, like, okay, my partner or my colleague did the best they could with the situation they had, instead of thinking, oh, that was dumb, or didn't they do this or that, or why didn't they, sometimes recognizing people are coming across and doing the best they can with the tools that they have in front of them at the time. But also recognizing, as with colleagues, and I think most of us understand this in this kind of culture we have, that there's a lot of stress that comes with being a physician these days. And it's difficult to deal with and difficult to manage. Some of us do it better than others, and being empathetic to that, because it's not just a fleeting few. We have statistics out there that's saying half the physicians out there qualify or would mark off enough symptoms to be considered burnt out. That's a real issue. People are struggling with that. And I think that's that other piece, that this burnout issue is pretty significant. A lot of people are affected by it, and a lot of people are struggling with the kind of motivation to kind of get going and get to work and being able to be willing to, put themselves out there to help others, and at the expense sometimes of themselves. And being empathetic to that, understanding that, and being able to sometimes, obviously not diminish any patient care, but also understand when somebody may need a break or need help or reach out to somebody because they might be struggling. It may not be just because they're negligent, or they don't care, or they're lazy, or those kind of things that sometimes get thrown with somebody when they need the time, or they need different accommodations to handle a situation. And of course, the last thing with colleagues is personality issues. And I think that's a big one. I mean, I know I get phone calls several times a year about, physicians who's struggling with their interaction with their staff, or with getting bad patient reviews or things like that. And how do we fix this? And the reality is we all have our different personalities and different things that makes us who we are, and the different quirks we have. And sometimes those personality things, they are like oil and water. They don't mix. One of the things I've had to learn about with working with colleagues is there are certain type of personalities that are a little bit more challenging for me to work with than there are other ones. And I have to learn how to, sometimes change how I interact with somebody that's not on the same, doesn't respond the same way I do, as well as be able to be clear about where my boundaries are at with those kind of issues. And understand they're coming from their point of view, their perspective of this thing. This is how they evolved, and people tend to not be willing to look at their points of views and their perspectives if all they do is getting combated. So if I find ways to interact with people that they find they're not being combative, but being understood, even though they may not be changing how I feel, but at least they're being heard, allows them to let down the guard and be willing to be more receptive to things that you might be suggestive of, and changing and points of view that you bring to the table. And then finally, just talking about the kind of the healthcare system's perspectives, right? The one I hear all the time, right, is electronic medical records. They're not good. They slow things down. They do all this stuff, and I'm not saying that they don't. What I'm saying is we already come in with a negative perspective of how they're going to do, how they're going to work, and it tends to carry there. So anytime something doesn't work, it's like, see, there it goes. And I think it's probably, if we thought about it and we're using a system like that, we tend more of the time we're doing what we need to do and it's accomplishing the goal it is. And we do run into roadblocks sometimes, but it is accomplishing, most of the time what we're trying to get done. And so the goal is to try to be able to say, like, even though there's roadblocks, there's hiccups, there's challenges, there are some things that are coming out of this that are beneficial. how do I change my perspective so I don't get so negative, so I don't get so overwhelmed by it, and I don't find myself just fighting against the system? Because that's one of those things. Again, I do the stress and burnout lecture a lot with things that we're not going backwards with the electronic records. We're only going to be moving forward. Now, hopefully, improving them to even become more user friendly, but they're here to stay. And then the other things about the healthcare system, like, do my personal values match up with what the healthcare system are? And then, what's my point of view? Why I'm here doing this? What did I perceive this? How can I, either if they're, too disconnected, what does that mean? If they are things that I need to look at, like that are different from what I do, and look at that and look at how the bigger goal is for that. Being willing to just kind of explore those different things, when you're into a system, because ultimately I think we get in this thing to help others because of one desire to want to help other people, but it's also it is a business, and sometimes those things can collide and create a challenge. So we're getting kind of close to the end of this presentation, and I just kind of threw out these kind of questions on the conclusion, like. And these are grand pitches. I don't necessarily know if there's going to start a dialogue or anything about this, but just kind of, asking yourself, what are your perceptions? Not only just in your personal world, but your professional world. And, where do they lead you? Where do they guide you? What are the things that are strong and kind of put you in the right place? What are the things that are kind of a little bit of roadblockage? What moves might benefit from changing perspectives? Like what would happen? What may come from if I did challenge or change some perspectives? And, how do your perspectives affect, I think I said that at the beginning, affect you as a physician? So anyhow, I appreciate you taking the time to be here. I'm going to give a little bit of time at the end of this to just kind of keep it open if anybody wants to discuss any more about perceptions and perspectives. I think this is just more of an open topic to kind of think about how is it hard and challenging for us to change and not change about things, with the stuff that's going around us. Again, I apologize for the cold and having to bring the tissues in and coughing a few times, but I'll turn it over to Caitlin now. Thanks.
Thank you, Nelson. Does anyone have any questions or comments or scenarios? Anything you'd like to share with the group at all? I jotted down one general kind of question, especially as we head into this holiday season with a lot of friends and colleagues and family.
Right.
Large group of people you may not see on a day-to-day. Do you have any easy tips or tricks to arm ourselves with, kind of to stay positive and open
Right.
minds with all the different perspectives?
Right, because we might have to find ourselves in interactions with people that we don't always see the same viewpoint with.
Sure.
Well, that's I think, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, I think if I'm comfortable with my perspectives, then I don't have to really kind of worry about people that have the different views in my. That I'm kind of okay with where I am, what I am. And what I need to do, or may help me evolve a little bit more, is when I hear somebody has something that's not exactly the same, instead of getting in debate about it, which I found myself sometimes notoriously doing, especially with family members about certain things, is to kind of hear where they're coming from, not to have an argument, hope that they're willing to hear where I'm coming from, but if they're not, know that I will still set the tone of being able to be listen and just kind of, okay, I hear where you're coming from. And then, not acknowledging it that it's right as much as being able to say, okay, that's why you believe that. I just find that debate is really where debate has a healthy place, but if it's going to be in a place where there's two closed-minded ends, it's not going to get anywhere. So how do we have a thing where I set the tone? We're saying, I will listen to you, have that invitation out there, and hopefully by demonstrating my own behavior changes and not being combative, will that allow them to, maybe consider that with me. And maybe not, but that's my goal is not to change others, it's to change myself at times,
Great, thank you.